Because you had your conference in just opposite Milton Keynes Station, didn't you? Was that
that's
where?
right. Yeah, I mean, so we were on the original grounds of Bletchley Park as it was. It's something like 26 acres now, but it used to be about 56 acres. So we were on the grounds in the new Institute of Technology for the Bletchley campus of Milton Keynes College.
Yeah, no, it's a really nice venue. That I went. British Standards Institute had They had a fringe around. We all went to lots of fringes, didn't we? Fringe round the Bletchley summit. And that was at the same Milton Keynes venue.
Well, I did a fun post today because I've been talking a lot about that we're not having a real conversation about the future of jobs and AI. And I was at LinkedIn on Thursday for their Impact Summit. And I quoted this in my LinkedIn post this morning because the CEO of LinkedIn said, of course it will get more jobs. The internet did, so AI will. I was like, is that a good enough perspective?
Yeah, I mean, God. Well, discuss. Yeah.
Well, exactly. And so anyway, I said, people keep telling me that prompt engineering is a job. So I looked it up and I could find 2 jobs in London that had that listed for them 17 months after the release of ChatGPT. I said, would we consider 2 listings, a new industry, a new type of job?
Yeah, that's interesting. So the people who devise prompts or prompt injections or whatever it may be, the prompt engineers, are only 2 adverts for them.
2 adverts, yeah. In London. Might have been others in other areas of the country, but I mean, look, it's clearly part of another job for sure. But the idea that we keep saying this, and I just don't think it's real, that we'd have a new job, prompt engineer, which would mean that thousands of people will be doing this job. Otherwise, we can't call it a job, and they'd have to be paid £50,000 or £100,000 for this to be considered a job. And they're sort of guiding people on what to type. Well, it hasn't happened yet. So but it's 2:00, and so a huge welcome to Lord Tim Clement-Jones, who very kindly lets me call him Tim. It took about a year to stop calling you Lord Clement-Jones. I'm still working on it. One of my favourite people in the industry who's been extremely kind to our community over the last few years and does some incredible work. And I'll ask Jason in a moment to introduce Tim, and then very kindly me as well. But a huge welcome to everybody that's here. There's 37 of us, probably including a few bots who have arrived so far, and a few more on the way, I'm sure. And so we've got 1 hour with Tim. So we're very, very lucky. I've got some questions lined up, and we've collected some questions ahead of time from the community. But here's how we run these events. We encourage as many people as possible. So please, all of you, do put your cameras on. If you're in a noisy environment, obviously just keep that microphone on mute, but we'd love to see you. You're certainly on our screens. I can see lots of people already. Then let's jump into the chat. So in the chat, please do say where you're from or where you're currently located, because it sounds fantastic to see the global representation that we have at these sort of events. Put your LinkedIn URL if you want as well, so people know where to find you and maybe follow up with you afterwards. And then let's get chatting in the chat as well. Jazel's going to be monitoring the chat and pulling out some of the key comments and questions that we'll have time for. We've certainly put a dedicated 15 minutes at the end of this session anyway to get some of the wider questions from Tim. They'll go through Jazel, so do just flag her or tag her if you want her to call out your question. We'll do as much as we can in the hour. We'll say goodbye to Tim on the hour, but we may well keep the call open just a bit longer just to collect a few more thoughts. So delighted that everybody's joining us today. We're also celebrating Tim's new book, and I'll come to that in a moment. And I would encourage everybody absolutely to buy it. I had a copy, but somebody borrowed it and it's disappeared, so I can't show you right now, even though I asked them specifically not to take my book away. But do you want to show yours, Tim?
Yeah, there we go. That's it.
Amazing. I'm so happy to see this come out. The timing's fantastic, and we're in good hands with people like Tim writing about this. As per normal, we do these things with a huge amount of kindness and inclusivity. We don't believe anybody in this room is an expert above anybody else. We're all coming at it from our own different perspectives and ideas, and they're all so important. AI needs all of us on this journey and in these conversations, not just a few left brain thinkers in a few parts of the world. And Jazel, if you would open the session for us, and then we'll jump in with the conversation.
Absolutely. I think I'm so glad to be here and so glad to meet Lord Tim Clement-Jones on a Zoom call. This is my first time I'm actually seeing him. And I think conversations like this are so crucial, especially today with the way the AI and XR is evolving each day. And it's a double-ended sword, to be honest. And to understand the risks, the safety around it, the dilemmas that ethics has, the trust, the accountability, etc. There's so much to it, along with the benefits that it can give. So I think including the whole community and having this conversation is going to take us to another level to understand the societal impact and the impact on the future of work that we are going to be having. So this whole conversation, and I think, Richard, what you have done is including the community into the questions that has also brought a new vista to this whole inclusive forum that we generally have. So I think a lot of diversity, inclusion to this dialogue is going to take us to the next level. Now, before we start, I want to introduce Lord Tim Clement-Jones. He was made CBE for political services in 1988 and a life peer in 1998. He's Liberal Democrat House of Lords, spokesperson for science, innovation, and technology, a member of the AI in Weapons Systems Select Committee, former chair of the House of Lords Select Committee on AI, which sat from 2017 to 18. He's also the co-chair and founder of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on AI, a founding member of OECD's Parliamentary Group on AI, and a consultant on AI policy and regulation to global law firm DLA Piper. He's the author of the book Living with the Algorithm, AI Governance and Policy for the Future. I think we just saw the book just now, and it's an amazing introduction, Lord Tim Clement-Jones. I'm so glad to see you here. I think we should also introduce Richard.
You should have done me first, Jaisal. This is really embarrassing now.
I think you are known to many people, so it is important to know Lord Tim Clement-Jones first, according to me.
My bio is just that I know Lord Tim Clement-Jones.
Let's go for your intro, Richard. So Richard Foster-Fletcher, as you all know, is an artificial intelligence advisor, author, and speaker, and a top voice on LinkedIn. Drawing on his experiences of working in blue chip technology companies, he founded MKAI.org, an organization dedicated to the responsible implementation of AI. He also hosts the Boundless podcast. He speaks about AI inclusivity, digital ethics, and the future of work, delivering lectures at LSE, UCL, Oxford University, and Imperial College London. A graduate of the MIT AI Strategy course and a published author on the future of AI. Richard is a member of the UN Resilience Frontiers Advisory Group for Communicating Climate Change and an advisory board member for the South Central Institute of Technology and the African Institute for AI. I think that introduction is mind-blowing, isn't it?
Well, I'll have to check with my mum, see if she's proud.
For the rest of the conversation, Richard.
Yeah, so I just mentioned one thing before we dive in. We're ahead of time, which is great. So we actually have these conversations every day, would you believe it? And we do it in our WhatsApp group, 440 something people, many of whom I can see on this call who are fabulous and so interesting to speak to. It is a blessing to be in their company. So come and join us. We've got room for a few more, I'm sure. You don't need to be an expert. You need to just have an interest in these sorts of topics, which is the intersection of where AI meets society, business, climate, equality, all these areas that we get into. So do come along and we'll approve your request to come and join us in the group. And I also, while I'm doing links, I want to get this one in as quickly as possible. And I'll probably share this a few times and ask. I just read that in the chat. And I'll share that a few times. And that's Tim's book. So do absolutely get yourself a copy. The thing about Tim's book is that it really will be relevant to you no matter what your level of expertise is. You know, somebody could pick this up in Waterstones and they would certainly get a good understanding of what's going on without prior understanding. And we know it's getting into the hands of people who are literally making critical decisions on this as well. So very accessible, but also it'll take you further for sure. Big fan of what you've written, Tim. Let's just review a little bit more about the book. So it's called Living with the Algorithm, Servant or Master, which is a very leading statement to get us into the topic today. You talk about AI governance and policy for the future. So the book navigates the delicate balance between harnessing AI's transformative potential and ensuring robust ethical governance, which you fully believe is possible and doable, and we have the tools and the will now. It provides insights for understanding the global landscape of AI policy. Themes include ethics and regulation, global perspective on AI governance, impact on democracy, public sector implications, IP, one of my favorite topics, legal practice and AI, convergence of standards, and future directions in AI safety and regulation. So, Tim, just to rest my voice for a second, a huge welcome to you.
Thank you very much. I'm Richard. It's great to be here. And Jaisal, thank you for that lovely introduction. Really appreciated. Yes, I mean, I do cover quite a bit of the regulatory waterfront, and we haven't even started talking about autonomous weapon systems or live facial recognition. But AI is increasingly pervasive in our lives, and it is so. The use cases are so varied. That a lot of people have said to themselves, "Well, we can't regulate this; it's far too diverse." But I do believe, and I think if you start at first principles with the ethics involved, and that's very much your approach in MKAI, I think if you start at first principles, then you can develop both regulation and standards. And you can do it not just on a national basis, you can do it on an international basis. And I think one of the exciting things about our conversation today is you've got quite an international group of people on this call. And I think what I wanted to do, I didn't want to be overly UK minded, but obviously a lot of the examples inevitably come from the UK in terms of things like digital exclusion and the kinds of regulation that might be appropriate, or from Europe or whatever. But I do think there are certain common factors which can be drawn from this. In whatever continent of the world you are, and where I think legislators and governments and so on need to be much more aware and much more active than they are already being. I mean, partly one of my main motives for writing the book was as a reaction against very slow government action here in the UK. And then I really got the bit between my teeth when I looked at the Bletchley summit and thought, well, so what's the outcome of this summit that's going to prove useful for the ordinary person in terms of protection against some of the risks of AI? Because I'm a tech enthusiast, but I think unless you get public trust and public protection right, then we're not going to be able to use the technology to its best and fullest extent. So we have to ask ourselves the question, and you'll see this running through the book, is not whether we're not just what we do in terms of innovating. It's should we be using AI in certain circumstances? So there are kind of moral issues involved here as well. This isn't just a given that this is a technology we apply right across the board without any thought.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a lot in there, Tim. And I think when we look at these risks, we know right now we're dealing with biases and misinformation and harms. As we look a little bit across the horizon, we can see the risks of job displacement, erosion of the middle class, of course, that would come with that. And we think about some of the older industries like mining, where a lot of jobs were lost, and places in the UK and the US and others, never recovered. And then even longer from that, we think about alignment and we think about control. But we've got very much issues today, 10th of May, and we've got issues that are maybe 10 years away, and we need to align our focus appropriately. I think just thinking about the national international question for a bit, you could look, if we took climate change as an analogy for this, you could look at the UK and say, well, it's not really going to make a huge amount of difference what we do in the UK compared to China or other places. But that's not entirely true, because what we can do is we can show leadership. We can inspire others to show what's possible. Do you feel that we're doing any of that in AI, regulation, safety? Okay, no, I see your immediate expression.
I think we've got some of the institutions that are leaders in this field. I mean, I do think people like the Turing are a great powerhouse for, if you like, tech analysis and understanding. And some of the work they've done has been groundbreaking, especially with what was formerly the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation in terms of their trust barometer and things like that. And also, we've got some institutions like the Ada Lovelace Institute, which is, if you like, a subset of the Nuffield Foundation, but they've done some groundbreaking work on the kinds of regulation that we should be seeing here and now in terms of mitigating the risks of AI of the kind that you're talking about. I'm a believer that regulation is, perfectly practical. And if I didn't, I'd be one of the doomsters, because there's a bad narrative. If we're not careful, the narrative runs away with you with AI. You get the Stephen Hawking narrative, the best or worst thing for humanity. Or you get the Elon Musk narrative saying it's more dangerous than nuclear weapons. Well, if we're not careful, that's the narrative that sticks. And that's why it's up to legislators, regulators, people like me, academics, opinion formers like you, I think, to make sure that we have a culture and a climate where there is pressure to have regulation. Now, how you do that internationally is really, really important because, at the moment, we've got a little bit of competition in this area. The EU, having, in a sense, established the GDPR as the data protection gold standard, was pretty determined to make the AI Act the AI gold standard. And probably because we've been rather slow off the mark, that is probably going to happen, basically. But the saving grace is that underneath that, whatever level of regulation, and we're all going to vary in our cultures. I mean, our government has explicitly said that they're not regulating for the moment. They believe we need to evaluate risk more, and they're more into existential risk and all this kind of stuff. Wait till artificial general intelligence comes down the track. Well, I don't believe that. But in the meantime, I think it's possible, and it is happening, to agree on international standards. So the National Institute for Standards and Technology in the States, CENELEC in Europe, British Standards Institute, the IEEE, some private sector organizations, ISO, they are coming together. And we're not quite there yet in terms of identifying, exactly, how many key standards we need and what the essential ingredients are. But certainly in terms of a risk assessment framework, that is beginning to happen. The OECD has done some really valuable work on that. And so I'm slightly torn between sort of saying, well, it doesn't really matter what the UK does because, quite frankly, we're going to have to sign up to the AI Act if we're going to have access to a market. If a developer, for instance, is going to have access to a market of 450 million people. And by and large, if you're a public procurer, you're going to find that the software that you buy will probably conform to those regulations. But you can certainly, I think, bank on the fact that in a few years' time, we're going to have a set of common standards between ourselves, the States and Europe. The bigger question is how much broader than that we can go. Can we include India? And I know we've got members from India on the call today, Pakistan. It would be fantastic if we could get a sort of broad sign up. And the kinds of standards I'm talking about are, yes, risk assessment framework, audit, training, testing, monitoring, continuous monitoring, a suite, if you like, of standards which we could expect both predictive AI and generative AI to adhere to. And I don't believe that's too pie in the sky, frankly.
I just want to pick up on some of the ways that you described the narrative around AI, maybe a slightly left field question. So is it about what gets regulated then? And do you think that there's an intent here from certain parties that they're just trying to move the goalposts so that some things can get regulated and it'll leave a bit of a free-for-all in other areas?
That's a really tricky one. I mean, because in a sense, you don't quite know whether it's all about double bluff. I mean, we've had people like Sam Altman of OpenAI saying almost regulate me, you know. But on the other hand, they've been quite keen on signing up to things like the Bletchley Declaration, the White House statement, the guidelines there, you know. So it's not entirely clear. I think it all depends what the threat of regulation is at the end of the day. And certainly that's true in the competition field. I mean, let's not forget, you know, and I noticed you picked up on the IP point as well. I mean, there are four really crucial areas here. First of all, the whole area of regulation of broader AI use, predictive AI, generative AI, if you like, the civilian use. Then you've got lethal autonomous weapons, the use of AI in those. Then you've got the intellectual property aspects, which are really important. And you know, you've got to make sure that you're getting all that right as well. So and then, of course, public sector is the fourth area. Things like live facial recognition, surveillance by the police, and so on and so forth. So you've got to segment this a little bit in terms of thinking about the different ways and different contexts in which you probably need to regulate AI as well, and have certain standards.
Which of those two narratives that you mentioned that are coming out of certain parties bothers you more? Is it the narrative that it's moving too fast, so you can't regulate it? Or is it that we should be focusing on the existential risk? Because both of them seem like red herrings, but they're both quite common, aren't they?
Yes, and sometimes exactly the same people put forward both arguments. So I say a curse on both your arguments, basically, if that isn't a sort of perversion of a quote from the Bible or whatever. But I mean, I do believe that you've got to knock down these skittles. You've got to knock down the arguments. That's what, you know, debate is all about. It's what Parliament's all about. It's what democracy is about, is that we debate amongst ourselves and we try and get the arguments right. I mean, our government is very keen on the argument that by and large, regulation is the enemy of innovation. Well, I don't believe that. I think regulation, certainly in terms of business certainty, can underpin innovation, because you have the confidence that you know that you can have a sandbox and all that kind of thing, but at the end of the day, you know pretty much what you're going to have to conform to in broad terms, if there are standards out there, if there's regulation out there. Whereas if it's just a free-for-all, it's everybody for themselves in a sense. And you don't know what the future holds, really. So although I'm a great believer in competition, I think unbridled competition, which has no regard to, if you like, the purpose, the beneficial purpose of what you're trying to do, that's not the direction that I would want to go. And of course, I mentioned competition a few moments ago. We don't know how many big players we're going to have out there. You know, at the moment, what have we got? 5 big players in AI systems. I mean, give or take, it's all inter-owned. I mean, Microsoft has got its own AI operation now, but they own a very large chunk of OpenAI, and Anthropic is owned. I think it's got relationships with Amazon. So all of these major platforms, AI platforms, have relationships with the existing big tech companies.
To the title of your book, Who Controls the Algorithm? And I agree with you. In fact, we don't even need to say it's our viewpoint. What you said a moment ago comes from Joe Biden. He said in the US a couple of years ago, he said, we do not have capitalism, we have extortion. Because of the monopolies that are in place, they don't allow real innovation to take place. And I don't disagree. Mm. But so who does control the algorithm then?
Well, that's a very good question. I don't think we have enough visibility. And, I know one of the key takeaways from your conference back last year was transparency and accountability. And I do think those two things are very much missing. I mean, you could argue, for instance, that the data protection laws have some ability to control the data inputs into AI and sometimes the data outputs. And there are equalities legislation as well in terms of bias and so on. But it's the transparency, which I don't think there's really, when you look at the gap analysis of what is there in terms of existing legislation versus what you need to have, it's really, a lot of it's about explainability, transparency, accountability at the end of the day that we need to inject into the regulatory system.
Just on the data side and the IP side a little bit, have we missed the boat? Because these platforms have already harvested and hoovered up huge amounts of copyrighted material to build these platforms. They're now valued at multi-billion-dollar companies. They've got millions of customers, and they've probably done enough to be immovable now as entities.
I think if you like, the tallest horses probably jumped out of the stables. There are still quite a few horses in there, basically. If you're using the analogy of shutting the stable door after the horses have left, I think we still have a chance there. If you notice, the other day, the Financial Times came to an arrangement with OpenAI in terms of OpenAI's licensing of material from the FT as part of its training material for its ChatGPT, family, so to speak. And I think that's a very good development. I mean, of course, we're quite fortunate in the UK in having quite robust copyright law and quite robust courts that enforce that. Now, in the States, the fair dealing exception is more difficult in terms of interpretation, and that's why there's a heck of a lot of litigation going on there. And even in Europe now with the AI Act, in a way, they've given something away, and the creative industries are not particularly happy. There's a new text and data mining exemption, which you can opt out of, but it's not that easy, frankly. But if you don't opt out, then it is a text and data mining exemption that can be used by AI developers to train their algorithms, and so you're in trouble there. Whereas we don't have that. We resisted. Luckily, we got there before the minister signed off on it, and that was only a year ago. We resisted having a text and data mining exemption through a campaign by the creative industries. Now, I suspect many other jurisdictions are going to have a view about that. I mean, look at the Indian creative industries, amazing, in terms of novelists, in terms of films and music and so on. And I hope, for the sake of the creative artists in that jurisdiction, for instance, that they're looking at their IP protection.
As a small anecdote, I was using an app called Lensa, where you upload 20 photos of your face, and then it starts pulling you into all sorts of fun AI poses and outfits. And one of them you can select is luxury clothes. And when you get these photos back, you can still see the logos. So you look down and you see the Gucci logo in the corner of the photo. So they haven't even managed to get rid of it.
Wow. It's embedded. That's quite effective watermarking, isn't it? Which we keep being told is not really possible. But there we go. Because, the whole deep fakes argument at the moment, in a year where something like 2 billion people are going to the polls. And of course, India is going through 7 stages, I think, of its polls. Whether or not there's control over deep fakery is of crucial importance.
Yes, massive indeed. Just to give ourselves a moment to reflect, Jaisal, could you maybe just give us a few comments from the chat, things that are coming through, so we can pick up on the room a bit more?
Absolutely. I think the chat is really busy, and it is interesting to see so many perspectives and questions from people. But at the moment, we will look at the comments which are coming in. I'll read some of them, not all of them, because we have a time constraint here. So one of the comments that came from Alex is, my concern is how we keep ethics front and center in regulation of AI. There are few examples right now where ethics have been pushed into the background. Weapons to Israel and other places, IP on social media platforms, including YouTube and Spotify, and personal data ownership. There's another comment which was quite interesting from Jazz. There is currently significant lack of congruence and coherence within AI, ethics, DEIB, and ESG policy implementations, and also mutually between them. When these clash, we get the Google ethnic Nazi debacle. Organizations don't want to risk that, and so besides regulation, businesses are terrified of such PR disasters. One came from Bogdanji. Regulations should address security standards for AI systems in national security policies. Existing security frameworks are not adequate for AI deployed at scale. Similarly, Nish mentioned product safety and liability is another area of tangible risks in the AI domain. So we are seeing a mix of comments of what people feel about regulations, what are the risks areas that they are coming across or they feel needs most attention. And interestingly, from Paul, we have regulation is often literally linked to rules. That's a pity because regulation also means processes which create efficient and effective flow. And Patricia has mentioned the issue is also that those sitting on the boards of AI companies are the same. We have the same people governing all AI. I think this was really interesting. And to end with, if you work like a robot, you will be replaced by one. Some of the algorithmic space must have value contributed to it by human consciousness. The way we maintain sovereignty is as human beings. I think these are quite a bit of comments that came from the chat. I can add more and more, but I think that will take away all the time of it.
Shall I make just a quick comment about about three particular areas? I think it'd be quite. For a start, what we're not trying to do is centralize control over regulation. This is not government controlling what AI is or is not developed. It's mitigating, it's basically trying to mitigate the risks that arise from different forms of AI, which means that certain forms of AI are not going to be enabled. And the EU has a very explicit risk-based form of regulation. We haven't yet adopted anything along those lines, and nor have the Americans. So there's going to be a debate about how far you go in terms of cautiousness, if you like, about the precautionary principle, really, as to whether or not you're going overboard by being too cautious in regulating. But that's a debate to be had. But it is not about saying to Anthropic, you will only do this form of AI. Because actually that's not how it works. But for instance, it is about saying, look, if you are going to produce deep fake pornography, you're going to get fined, whether or not you share that on social media or you are facilitating that with your software. The second one is I am deeply worried on the weaponry front, and I entirely agree. We're seeing AI systems now being deployed. And the latest is Gaza, but also it's been true in Ukraine and in Libya. The growing use of autonomous drones and targeting systems, AI targeting systems, is becoming now commonplace. And the whole idea that you should have meaningful human involvement in these kinds of weapons is A, crucial, but B, being eroded. And Professor Stuart Russell, who I've got a great deal of admiration for, has been campaigning long and hard to get international agreement on this kind of thing. Now, you may say, look, that's a bit of a pie in the sky thing. But we did it with nuclear weapons. This is more difficult because, in a sense, these drones and the AI systems are more retail, if you like. They can get in the hands of bad actors much more easily. But nevertheless, we should give it a try. And there are initiatives at the UN in the Convention for the Committee for Conventional Weapons, and we should give that the best possible shot. The third thing I would say is that, yes, I agree that the implementation of regulation based on principles internationally is very, very difficult. But the OECD, let's not forget, got the G20 and its own members in the OECD to sign up to a pretty decent set of principles back in 2019. And in my view, it is possible, in a sense, to circumnavigate the regulation by saying, well, why don't we make sure that we have sets of standards which incorporate those principles, and those standards are highly practical, and as they're the sort of things I've talked about earlier. But then you can leave it up to each individual country, in a sense, as to how tough to be with their regulation. At the end of the day, it will probably come together, but just take longer, because politicians don't really understand a lot of this stuff. And, they think that if you regulate in a different way, that may give you a national competitive advantage of some sort, not really realizing that nearly everybody in this field operates internationally in one form or another, whether it's the academics with spin-outs or developers wanting to exploit their systems abroad, whether it's multinational companies having to conform to ethics and regulation. So, this idea of that we can be exceptional by having lighter regulation than anybody else is for the birds, frankly. And for me, the proof of that is the fact that the people who have the heaviest regulation on large language models, on generative AI, and now the Chinese. In the private sector, large language models developed by people like Tencent and Alibaba are subject to stringent regulation. And that's more than any other place in the world currently.
Thank you, Jaisal. I just want to jump on that last point, but are they looking to regulate for different means than we are in China, though? Are they protecting different people in different ways when you talk about that?
Yes, absolutely. But they signed up to the Beijing principles, which are exactly the same as the OECD principles back in 2019. So you might have your suspicions that this is, for the benefit of the government, that they don't want to have competition from the private sector, or the private sector to use powerful AI, which might impact on the Chinese constitution, if you like, putting it in that neutral way. But they would argue that it's in line with the Beijing principles, which are, conventional ethical principles. So, it's difficult to say, but it is a fact that, they have got things like deep fakes pretty heavily under control, whereas we don't.
We definitely don't. And if you don't even know what a deep fake is, it's hard to know if you're looking at one.
Well, it's all right to dress up in Gucci, but, going beyond that, Richard, that's the problem.
They weren't actually photos of me, for the record.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
I was doing it for a friend. But anyway, so we don't have the climate change first mover problem then, the way you're describing, the one where no country wants to put in the legislations around emissions, because if they do it and no one else does, then their GDP will suffer.
Absolutely
You're not describing that, are you?
No, and I can, because, and it's very interesting the way you put it. Because in a way, the EU has had the first mover problem and will have the first mover problem. But they've, I think, been incredibly agile. They managed to alter the ingredients of the AI Act to take account of generative AI. Between ChatGPT coming out in whenever it was, 2022, and it's, pretty powerful form. I forget what it was, 3.5 or 4 at that time. But anyway, it became obvious that the AI Act was not going to be fit for purpose unless it separately dealt with generative AI, frontier AI, and so on. And they incorporated that and then signed off this April on the Act. Now, I think that's, in a sense, it's propelled the EU to be much more fleet of foot in the way that it produces regulation. So their first mover advantage may be sustained, actually.
What is that advantage? And have they not lost out on innovation and investment because of this?
No, I don't think so. I think that it's a bit like where everybody sucked their teeth when the GDPR came out, actually. But what happened? Microsoft said, no, this is the gold standard. We've got to adhere to this. When you've got 450 million consumers, this is quite tricky. Now, you know, and it's not very different, actually, because even in the data world, I mean, okay, the EU, you know, one of their official languages is English, but nearly all the, you know, so much of the English language content is created outside the EU. And in terms of data and so on, but nevertheless, the GDPR has really stuck. And I suspect that the AI Act, I mean, don't forget, there's also the process called reflection, where you put an act into being and it won't come in until 2026. You then have a 3-year period, and then you reflect on what's worked and what hasn't. And it's quite a good process. And I suspect that, you know, there'll be changes that need to be made. And actually, probably at the moment, there are changes that are going to be proposed to the EU GDPR as well. So I think, you know, then it's a pretty amazing thing that you can legislate for 27 member states and still be as agile as they are, quite frankly.
Yeah, EU, we miss you. And they did, of course, they made Apple change their phone chargers. So you're absolutely right about the power.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It doesn't stop Apple and Google, you know, trying to sue the hell out of the competition authorities. But at least you know where some of the power lies anyway.
Yeah, and personally identifiable data in the models is probably one of the next big ones to get right. But I take your point about charting a path and showing what's possible and showing leadership. I'm agree with you. I just want to come to a couple of things that were raised before the session, because we've talked a little bit about other countries. And one of the concerns I think that comes out across the world is that these big AI models, such as ChatGPT, they're trained on Western data. Have you heard those sort of issues being raised, and how have you spoken about them before?
Yes, I think it's a real issue. I mean, it's, you know, if you're not careful, it's another form of imperialism, really.
Colonialism,
colonialism, and you have to be extremely aware of all that. But for my money, I mean, that's a government, a government issue in those jurisdictions, and it's something that big tech need to look after. I mean, I had a joint committee which looked at our online safety bill, which was all about social media and so on. And the parallel is that we discovered that Meta, Facebook, have a much, much lower level of moderation of messaging on their platforms outside the main English language areas. I mean, you know, for instance, Arabic Facebook has a much lower level of moderation and, if you like, control over what's happening between users. You know, that is a really bad thing, because it means that what you're getting a much less safe service on those social media platforms. Now, if the same is going to be true about AI, which it probably will be, it could well be, you know, it's kind of one size fits all, move fast and break things approach, then I think that is something that governments have to deal with as well, because you're stacking in inherent bias in there, because it's purely Western data.
Yes. Yep. Basically, yeah. If the internet must be 78-80% English language. It must be.
Yeah.
I'm running the clock down a little bit here, so I want to ask you one of the big questions, so I don't miss out on the chance to ask it. What do you think it will take to get some global agreement? And I emphasize the word "some" there. And I sense that you don't think that the AI safety summits and declarations are the vehicle that necessarily will take us there. But I don't mean to put words in your mouth.
No, I don't think the Safety Summit is designed to do that, basically. I mean, if only they'd ended by talking about international standards at the end of the Bletchley Declaration, I would have actually bought into some of that. And, you know, we've had some initiatives. The French and Canadian initiative, the Global Partnership on AI, for instance, I thought might develop into a sort of agreement on standards, or at least an agreement to agree on standards. But the best forum at the moment, and we've seen them do some really good work on things like sovereign wealth funds and digital taxation, is the OECD. And that's why I'm quite an enthusiast, actually, for the Global Parliamentary Group on AI in the OECD, which Anthony Gooch, who is no longer with them, but he set it up. And he's their sort of he was their head honcho on communications and so on. And he could see that the OECD could play a really useful role, because it's a very broad church, and they are now, they've published really good stuff on classification, which people use. They're publishing more and more stuff on standards, starting with risk assessment framework, and the commonalities between various risk frameworks, such as those in the States and so on. So I think if I was going to put my money on it, and in the education field, UNESCO has got quite a lot of purchase, as far as I'm concerned. It's got a brand that people trust. And therefore, if they come up with standards and so on for use of AI in education, then I think that's going to be pretty important. If you're talking international, obviously at national level, there are quite a few players, and I mentioned Ada Lovelace earlier. Sir Anthony Selden in the education field is doing a lot. There's a lot happening in the health field, but of course, health is one of those areas where you already have quite heavy ethical screening of research projects and R&D type activity. So in a way, you don't necessarily need to have a hugely different set of ethics from the existing research ethics in health.
Okay. And what would you see as the role for the UN more generally?
Oh, I think the UN really, its main role is going to be in the weaponry area. I'm not a great believer in this atomic energy authority stuff. That the equivalent of this international body that oversees the creation of generative AI and frontier AI and so on. I just can't envisage. We're not talking about world government here, for heaven's sake. We're talking about interoperability of standards. But when it comes to arms, that is a different issue. You are talking about control, and you are talking about serious existential danger if basically your warfare is conducted by machines, because of the collateral damage that a machine is not going to be able to assess the proportionality of. The way that the current military is meant. And I say meant, and I emphasize that. I've been to Northwood, I've been to Strategic Command, I've seen what the military do when they go through the steps before they say fire on a particular target. Is they have to assess very carefully what the impact will be, what the collateral damage is, whether that is proportional to the aim, to the war aims of the particular campaign, and so on. And you do that on the battlefield, and you have a chain of command, and it goes all the way through the chain of command, and it goes right up the chain if the collateral damage is going to be disproportionate. So, and you don't take that decision. Now you can't do that with AI. It's much more difficult because, if your involvement is only token, you've got some targeting software that says, these are the bad guys that we've identified, and this is where they are. I mean, at the moment in Gaza, you've got 3 different AI systems which are used, to identify, to find the place, then to identify whether the people are in the place. So it's quite complex, but at each stage, I'm not convinced that there's enough meaningful human involvement.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you for those comments. There's a lot to do in that for sure, and
and it's an issue that gets closer and closer to us that we need to sort out.
Yes, I'm going to hand over to Jaisal just for a second to make sure that we've covered some of the questions that were asked in advance, and also see what else has been arising on the chat. But maybe just a slightly more positive note, Tim. I know how AI has influenced my life and made more time available for me for my health and wellness, and it's been wonderful for that, especially for an application that costs just a few pounds a month. But when we think about the broader world and artificial intelligence, we think about people living in countries like Bangladesh and others similar to that. How is AI potentially going to improve their quality of life, do you think, over the next few years?
Well, I think you have to, first of all, start with asking whether people are going to be digitally excluded, whether they will have the access to the internet, to Wi-Fi, to devices that can be used as platforms for AI, basically. So I think you've got to start at the ground level. After that, I think it could be fantastic, because it means that people could work from home to a greater degree, using AI tools. You've got apps now, for almost everything in the workplace. And it's very interesting, isn't it, how quickly Microsoft, for instance, has introduced Copilot into its suite of products. It will mean that, for instance, calculation of what the climate is doing in terms of, and what crops you grow, and even on a small scale level, you're going to find retail type things that AI can deliver for an ordinary SME, whether they're an agriculturalist or whether they're a shopkeeper. These things are going to be more and more available, but it does need to come with a consciousness that you must get rid of digital exclusion, and also much greater digital literacy. So people shouldn't start running before they can walk in that respect. Overexcitement, is fine in the short term, but I think what we have to do is make sure that people can take the benefit.
Absolutely. And I think that's the key, isn't it, overarchingly, is how do we get as many ships as possible to rise with the tide that is AI, and not just a few oil tankers. And I had a teacher in one of the sessions we were doing, and they were pushing back on AI and really quite anti using it and so on. And when we broaden out the conversation, we have to acknowledge that in certain areas of the world, like the UK, we are living in a form of utopia. Now, we might all have mental health issues, but apart from that, it's utopic. But the problem with that is if it's propped up by other people living in a dystopia, that means that our goods and services and so on are made in ways that make other people's lives less enjoyable to the extent of trying to make ours more enjoyable. And I think ultimately for me, that's the greatest opportunity in AI, is that we don't have to reduce living standards from the 30 odd countries in the world that have raised theirs up significantly, but we stop relying on other people to fill those gaps in ways that are harming their lives and their environments and their prospects.
Yes, I think that's a very fair statement. If you can mitigate the risks broadly, it doesn't matter what jurisdiction, that it can be used as a leveling up tool across the board. I'm a great believer in AI being used to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, because I do believe that particularly in agriculture and in treatment of disease and so on, the analytical ability and the ability of AI to rattle through so many different possibilities and identify the ones that are really going to make the difference, or the crops that are going to be, appropriate for particular terrain, or identify where the real patterns of poverty are. It's great pattern seeker AI. I think it could be game changing, but we've got to understand how this is going to be delivered.
Yes, sir. Yeah, there's a lot to do on that for sure. And I think I'll just come to Jason now in 30 seconds. But your agricultural one, I think, is a great example. And it doesn't matter how brilliant in indigenous knowledge we have around the world. What do they know about farming in the face of climate change? Nothing. None of us do. And that's where we must absolutely have the access to the data and the recommendations and the patterns that you're saying,
Yep.
because you just can't know that stuff, no matter how close you are to the land and your crops.
Yep.
Right. Jason, you better catch us up. Sorry, we've only got 8 minutes because my last question turned into 4 last questions. But have we got a couple of questions that we can come to from the chat?
I was on mute. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
We have a lot of comments, but I won't use the comments now. Let's jump on to some of the questions which people are interested to ask. And let's pick up from the chat because you have asked most which came from the community directly. So I think Sue has asked, I'd love to know if Tim has any insights into what Labour would do on AI regulations were they to form the next UK government. They have been quiet so far.
Yeah, this is a question that I'm often asked, and I do know there's a great deal of curiosity on the Labour front bench. Peter Kyle, who is the DSIT Shadow Secretary of State, in particular, he's visited the States to talk about AI, and I know that they do plan to take this in hand. The only problem is we don't quite know anything about any detail. And the big problem from my point of view is that, of course, manifestos are written quite a bit before election times. They're normally pretty sketchy. They normally deal very much only with the absolutely key things: health, housing, education, cost of living, that kind of thing. They don't deal with this kind of area to any great degree. I mean, it may, obviously, if, for instance, we were talking about social media, that might be different. But AI is much broader than social media. And I don't think it's, people don't get up in the morning and say, what the hell is this government doing about AI? I mean, it's a relatively small community of people who are concerning themselves with this. That doesn't diminish its importance, in my view, but it isn't retail politics, basically. And it won't influence the outcome of an election. So I think we just have to hope. And of course, part of my job is, as another opposition party, is to try and put pressure by raising these issues. And because politics is a competitive sport, basically, to some degree, and nobody likes to be left behind. So, obviously, when I have a book launch, I invite Labour politicians and hope that they will read my book cover to cover. And it was partly to get opinion formers, not just from my own party on side, but I wrote the book because I wanted to show what was possible and the range of issues that, when we talked earlier, Richard, the range of issues that we need to address.
Thank you so much, Lord Tim. I think it has been great to hear it so honestly, what you think and how you can also influence using your political experience to the right people. Going on to the next question. Matt James has written, what issues do you think might arise from the differences between the EU AI Act and the US 14110 executive order? I'm thinking in context of the EU focusing more on safety versus the US focusing on commercial incentive.
Yes, but the executive order, of course, really applies to federal government more than anything else. It will, have influence on procurement by the federal government, and therefore indirectly will have quite an impact on the private sector developers. But it's designed for a different purpose. And again, sadly, I don't think there's time for any more congressional activity, really, before the presidential election. But, funnily enough, AI regulation in the States is relatively bipartisan. The number of bills that have come forward hoping to try and create some sort of regulatory structure have been from different sides of the House coming together. So I am optimistic that there will be something, but I don't think there's really much difference at this moment, which is going to impact on the philosophy of it between the US and the EU. I mean, I don't think the US, for instance, is going to suddenly jump up and down on behalf of OpenAI and Anthropic and Bard, Google, and so on. And say, oh, what are you doing in the EU? Why are you doing this? I think that point is past. And I think we're going to watch and wait and see how the EU AI Act pans out, which, I think we'll all be looking at with considerable interest. I come back to my standards again. I think where the countries can really come together and where we avoid conflict is by going for these international standards, irrespective of how different jurisdictions actually legislate and regulate.
I think taking from your last statement, I'll take a question from there, and this will be our last question, Richard, keeping time in mind. Coming from Global South, I actively realized that we end up being the test beds by the big tech and developed countries. There's no major tech transfer and also arbitrage element for exploitation. What are your views on the above, and how effectively can this be governed?
Well, I think we're back to Richard's point earlier. I mean, I think this is up to different jurisdictions, and and I think again, the more muscle that you can put together with other countries and say this is not good enough, you've got to be much more conscious that you need to tailor make your products for our purposes rather than trying to impose a product which has been trained on purely Western material. And you can do that through the OECD. I think that's a perfectly valid way of doing it, using other fora. The trade partnership in the Pacific could be used as part of that. Anything that gives you greater muscle in negotiation, I think, is useful. But I think the first thing that needs to happen is that it's the politicians that need to wake up really to the issues. Because I set up my all-party group in Parliament with a Conservative MP, very well-respected Conservative MP, because I didn't think we understood enough about this in Parliament. And that was 8 years ago. And I'm still not convinced we know enough about it. And I'm still not convinced we're doing enough because people don't understand enough.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lord Tim Clement-Jones. I think you've always put it so honestly and just put your views so straight. Back to you, Richard. We had actually on time. And,
you're perfect. We should have mailed Tim a microphone that you could have dropped on that last statement.
Yeah.
No, it's very powerful, and I'm inclined to agree with you. But I also want to mention the huge amount of work that you have done and the huge amount of progress that you have made to raise the awareness of these sorts of issues. And I'm sure anybody who's spent an hour with you, and I've spent even more time with you, I'm very lucky, sees that you have a very good grasp of the wider issues and the implications. And so, a huge thank you from me and this community for doing what you're doing. And I hope that you will keep the strength and the motivation to keep going with it. And we, of course, are at your service for the mission that you so diligently work on, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Jazel. And thank you, everybody. It's been a great session.